Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the final days of Jesus. Much of what we're going to be discussing in this series has leaned heavily from a book by the same title, authored by Andreas J. Kostenberger and Justin Taylor. Now, this is a fantastic book, and it's worth your time to purchase and to read, as it's going to go into much greater detail about the topics that we're going to discuss in this series. It's important before we begin also to discuss our other source material for which we're going to be using for the rest of the week to explore the final days of Jesus, the Bible, specifically the four Gospels. These are found at the beginning of the New Testament. We see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they contain eyewitness accounts and first-hand reports of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels are reliable sources of information for many factors. The first one being that Matthew and John, the authors of the first and fourth Gospels, were members of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Now, John was even part of Jesus' inner circle, and their records are trustworthy because they were on-site eyewitnesses of the accounts detailed in their writing. Now, Mark, the author of the second gospel, the church fathers tell us wrote his gospel in close association with the apostle Peter, which was also one of the 12 disciples, and he was a member of Jesus' inner circle, as well as a prominent spokesman of the 12. Last, we see Luke. Now, he himself was not an eyewitness. However, he sought to conduct a very careful investigation of these events. And in his writing, he even acknowledges his dependence on those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And you see this in the first chapter, verse 2 of his book. It is in these writings of these qualified authors where we get our source material for as we discuss the final days of Jesus. We hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome to our study, The Final Days of Jesus. Today we're going to talk about what happened on Tuesday, 3 days before Jesus' death on the cross and 5 days before his resurrection from the grave. It's Tuesday, March 31st, AD 33. Now it's Tuesday morning, and Jesus and his disciples are headed back to Jerusalem again on the same path they took yesterday morning from Bethany. They come upon a tree that Jesus had cursed the morning before for not bearing any fruit for him to eat when he was hungry. And Peter remarks that it has withered. Jesus takes this opportunity to encourage his followers to have faith in God. Mark 11, 22 through 26 records this, and he says, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone else, so that your Father who is also in heaven may forgive you your trespasses." He's saying if they believe and do not doubt, then they're going to be able to move spiritual mountains with their prayers. Now, Jesus used a curse over a fig tree, and speaking that in belief, to where he says if you speak in prayer and belief, that God will provide that for you. So Jesus continues on, and he gets to Jerusalem. The Tuesday morning there's still an electricity in the air. People are on the edge of their seats with this crazy excitement, wondering what in the world is Jesus going to do today? How can he top the days before? Now the priests, the scribes, and the elders, they waste no time, and they approach Jesus as he enters the temple. They confront him. They demand to know by what authority he is doing the things that he's done over the last few days. They were the ones with the authority, and they wanted Jesus to know that. Jesus had no right to do what he had done in the temple the days before. They were trying to back Jesus into the corner by depending on how he answered, by what authority he did these things. Depending on how he answered, they could arrest Jesus on sight. And really, this is what they wanted. In reply to the question, Jesus kind of turns the tables on them by asking them a question. He asks, was the baptism of John from heaven or man? And they're kind of caught in this because Jesus has asked them a question that either way they answer is going to make them look bad. If they answer from heaven, then Jesus was the Messiah that John the Baptist testified to, right? And if they answered it was from man, then they would incite a riot from the common people who revered John the Baptist as a prophet sent from God. After Jesus humbles himself, or after Jesus humbles the leaders asking this question, he leaves them unable to answer his question. He begins to teach in a series of parables. The first parable is of the two sons, and it's recorded in Matthew 21, verses 28 through 32. Now, in this parable, Jesus condemns the religious authorities for not believing in the message. Now, all the same breath, while the tax collectors and the prostitutes, which are held by most people as wicked, right? They believe and they get to enter the kingdom of God ahead of the supposed spiritual leaders of the time. This parable would have infuriated the Jewish leaders, but Jesus, he wasn't done. In the parable of the tenants, Jesus clearly relates the disobedient, thieving, and murderous tenants to the scribes, chief priests, and Pharisees. There would be no mistaking Jesus' intention in this parable. In the parable of the wedding feast, after that, recorded in Matthew 22, 1 through 14, Jesus clearly points out that the religious leadership has rejected God's invitation to the messianic wedding banquet. And they'll be judged while the invitation is extended to everyone. The leaders were going to have to take a different approach if they were going to take down Jesus. Being very aware of that, Jesus had the support of the people. They would have to trap him into incriminating himself and losing face in the people's eyes. The Pharisees began to get creative, and so they teamed up with the Pharisees were the religious leadership, and so they teamed up with the political leadership, the Herodian, and they tried to trap Jesus with a question. They came up to him and they asked him, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" Now, pretty good trap, because if Jesus answers yes, he would lose affection of the common people who really wanted the Messiah to overthrow the Roman rule for them, right? If Jesus answered no, he would be inciting a riot or revolt against the ruling law of the Roman Empire, right? Which the Roman Empire required payment of taxes to Caesar. So he's kind of trapped. The alliance of these two powers, the religious and the political, show us just how great of a threat they viewed Jesus to be. But Jesus' answer, it leaves the two sects, their jaws dropped open as he evades the trap that they set. He says, "Give to Caesar what's Caesar's." Now, on Roman money, Caesar's image is on the coin. And as long as Caesar was in power and had his image on it, it was his as far as Jesus was concerned. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Pay taxes to him. Thus returning to Caesar what was already his. But right after that, Jesus also urges his listeners to give to God what is God's. And that's a reference to the people being made in God's image. Therefore, the people belong to God. We owe everything to him. And after Jesus leaves the Pharisees and the Herodians at a loss for how to respond, then the Sadducees enter the scene. The Sadducees were a Jewish sect of individuals that denied the end-time resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, they try to trap Jesus in a theological conundrum. And Jesus again sidesteps the trap by quoting from Exodus, where God proclaims, "He is the God of the living and not the dead." And this silences the Sadducees, and they're amazed at his answer. And the last test of authority to Jesus comes in the form of an expert being sent through the Pharisees again. This expert asks Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus again responds by quoting the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, and Leviticus, saying, "Love God and love your neighbor." And Jesus' use of the Old Testament scripture here to answer these questions is brilliant, because these individuals can't refute this. They already believe the Old Testament to be absolute and complete truth, and they would never contradict it. And using something they can't contradict and refute because to them it's already truth, they're trapped. And they find themselves with no ground to argue. And then after being peppered with questions, Jesus goes on the offensive, right? And he begins to ask a question. And The question he asks is, how can the Messiah be both the Son of God and a descendant of David? God and human, right? No one could answer him. And seeing that he would easily best them, no one dared ask him a question again. Now, Jesus then kind of goes on this full-out assault against the religious authorities, and he removes any and all doubt of what his intentions are. He has no desire to ally himself with the current leadership. He has come to overthrow their authority and replace it with his own. It's obvious at this point there's no way that both sides can survive the escalating conflict. Either Jesus will assume power or he will face death. As Jesus is leaving the temple Tuesday evening, the disciples are discussing the size and grandeur of the buildings in the temple complex. Jesus overhears this, and he responds to them by prophesying that a day will come when not one stone will be left upon another, and all will be thrown down. Later that evening, the disciples come to Jesus and they ask him about this prophecy. When will it happen? They want to know when it's going to happen. And Jesus' response is lengthy and complex, but the main themes of Jesus' response, they reinforce his parables of the 10 virgins and of the talents, and really can be summed up by saying that the followers of Jesus will experience persecution and tribulation leading up to the final day of judgment, but they must remain vigilant and rest in their faith. These are the events that took place Tuesday, March 31st, AD 33, in the final days of Jesus. Closing today, I wanted to read an excerpt from our book that we're walking through together, because I believe that the authors clearly state the importance of what has happened in the final days of Jesus up to this point, and they set up the magnitude of what is about to happen in the days that follow. With this overview of the early events of Passion Week in mind, we have a good foundation of our closer look at Jesus' final days. The stage is set for the final act. The characters are in place. Their goals, motives, and intentions are clear. The king has come for his kingdom and has issued a clear and direct challenge to the reigning structures of political, economic, and religious power. The drama can end in only one of two ways. Either Jesus will topple the reigning powers and establish his messianic kingdom, or he will be killed. No one at that time could possibly comprehend that in God's mysterious plan, there was a third option. Find us on Facebook and YouTube tomorrow evening as we discover what happens next in the final days of Jesus.